The ground itself has been trying to speak for a long time. It is time to listen. There is a city called Pi-Ramesses. It was built in the eastern Nile Delta in the 13th century before the Common Era, a monument to the ambitions of Ramesses II, the pharaoh many scholars propose as the most likely candidate for the ruler of the Exodus narrative. The Book of Exodus names it directly. The Israelites, it says, were forced to build Pithom and Ramses, store cities, treasure cities, cities of bondage. For generations, this was presented as confirmation. The name is there. The pharaoh is there. The story must be true. What is the name of the largest and most systematic archaeological dig ever conducted at Pi-Ramesses? It was led by the Austrian Egyptologist Manfred Bietak, beginning in 1966 at a site called Tel el-Dabaa. Bietak and his team worked that ground for decades. They found the city. They found the storehouses. They found evidence of a large Semitic-speaking population living in the eastern delta during the Middle Bronze Age, roughly 1800 to 1550 BCE, centuries before the traditional Exodus date. They found graves. They found houses. They found the bones of daily life. What they did not find was any evidence of an enslaved Israelite labor force in the 13th century BCE, when Ramesses II actually reigned. The Semitic population at Tel el-Dabaa appears to have arrived, flourished, and largely departed before the traditional date of the Exodus by several hundred years. The temporal match fails. The mention of the city's name in the text may represent what scholars call an anachronism, a later editor updating the name of a place to one familiar to his readers, the way a modern novelist might describe someone driving to what we now call New York, even if the events occurred before that name existed. You have been taught that Ramses in the Bible is proof of history, but the man who spent 30 years excavating Ramses told a different story. Bietak found a Semitic presence, but not the right Semitic presence at the right time. The city confirms that Egyptians knew the name, knew the delta, knew the people. It does not confirm a 600,000-strong workforce. Nothing at Tel el-Dabaa comes close to that scale. The silence of the soil is precise and deliberate, the way a photograph that should contain a crowd contains only an empty field. And yet, the name was there, which raises a question that archaeologists have wrestled with since Bietak first filed his reports. What if the story is not fiction, and not history, but something older and stranger than either? What if it is memory, compressed and transformed across centuries of oral transmission, the way a river stone retains the shape of the water, but not the water itself? The number 600,000 is not a small claim. The Book of Exodus, in chapter 12, verse 37, states that approximately 600,000 men left Egypt on foot, besides women and children. Conservative scholarly estimates place the total Exodus population at somewhere between 2 and 3 million people. This is the number that matters, because this number leaves marks. What marks does a population of 2 million people leave? They leave middens, refuse pits, the archaeological signature of habitation, animal bone and broken pottery, and the compressed organic residue of human settlement. They leave hearths. They leave graves. They leave the chemical alteration of soil from sustained human contact. A population of 2 million people moving through a geographically constrained corridor. The Sinai is not large, and camping for 40 years in various named locations should leave evidence comparable to a medium-sized ancient city deposited directly onto the desert floor. The named stations of the Exodus journey are not obscure. Numbers 33 lists more than 40 of them. Scholars have spent a century attempting to locate them. Kadesh Barnea, where the Israelites reportedly dwelt for many years, has been identified with reasonable confidence as Ain el-Kuderet in the northeastern Sinai. Israeli archaeologist Eliezer Oren conducted systematic excavations there. The earliest remains date to the Iron Age, roughly 1000 BCE at the earliest, centuries after even the most conservative Exodus chronology. There is no Bronze Age stratum. There is no evidence of a mass encampment. There is a small Iron Age fortress, and beneath it, nothing that answers the call of the biblical narrative. Eleazar Oren himself published these findings without fanfare. He was not a polemicist. He was a careful, meticulous archaeologist who followed the evidence where it led. The evidence led into silence. Israel Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University, perhaps the most prominent Israeli archaeologist of the late 20th century, summarized the state of play in his 2001 book, co-authored with Neil Asher Silberman, The Bible Unearthed. The Exodus, Finkelstein concluded, cannot be confirmed archaeologically, not because archaeology is incomplete, but because the specific claims of the narrative, the scale, the route, the duration, are reconcilable with what the ground actually contains. Finkelstein did not say that lightly. He grew up in Israel. He built his career on the soil of the ancient Near East. He understood what it would cost, and the book appeared, was reviewed seriously, sold well in academic circles, and then was quietly set aside in the wider cultural conversation. The question it raised, if not Exodus, then what, proved too large for a single news cycle to carry. There is a document in the British Museum, catalogued as Papyrus Anastasi VI. It was written by an Egyptian border official during the reign of Pharaoh Merenptah, son of Ramesses II, around 1208 BCE. The papyrus records the passage of Shasu nomads, a term Egyptians used for Semitic-speaking pastoral peoples from the Levant, through the border fortress of Tijeku in the eastern delta. They were, the official noted, seeking pasture for their livestock. The Egyptian state registered their movement, noted their numbers, and permitted them to cross. This is the kind of document that historians love. It is routine, administrative, unself-conscious. It was not written to make an argument. It was written to record a transaction. And it tells us something important. The movement of small Semitic groups between Canaan and the Nile Delta was a normal, managed, unremarkable feature of Egyptian border administration in the late Bronze Age. People crossed. Herders crossed. Laborers crossed. Refugees crossed. What no Egyptian document records, in any archive so far discovered, is the presence of an enslaved Israelite population in Egypt, or the catastrophic plagues described in Exodus, or the loss of a pharaoh's army in the Reed Sea, or the departure of a people so vast they constituted a demographic event. Egypt was a literate civilization. They recorded military defeats, including their own, on rare and extraordinary occasions, such as the Kadesh battle inscriptions. They recorded famines. They recorded the movements of foreign peoples. They recorded the deaths of important men, an event of the scale described in Exodus, the death of the firstborn of every Egyptian household, the drowning of a chariot army, the departure of what amounted to the entire labor force of the eastern delta. Would have been an unimaginable catastrophe. It would have left administrative wreckage. It would have left something. What did the Egyptian state leave behind from this period? The records of Ramses II are among the most voluminous in Egyptian history. His reign produced the world's first recorded military treaty, the treaty with the Hittites following the Battle of Kadesh. His mortuary temple at Abydos contains detailed lists of his ancestors and his accomplishments. His monuments dominate the landscape from Abu Simbel to the Delta. In none of them, in no stele, no papyrus, no inscription on any temple wall, is there any reference to a Hebrew people enslaved in Egypt, any reference to the plagues, any reference to an exodus. The argument from silence is not always decisive. Absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, but there is a threshold at which an absence becomes impossible to explain away, and the absence here crosses that threshold. The Egyptian state did not merely fail to commemorate the Exodus, it failed to notice it, and the Egyptian state noticed nearly everything. Here is what the archaeology of Canaan does show, with remarkable clarity and consistency. It shows that in the late Bronze Age, roughly 1200 BCE, a new cultural group appears in the central highland region of what is now the West Bank and northern Israel. They build small villages. The villagers have a distinctive architectural form, the four-room house, a style not found in the lowland Canaanite cities of the same period. Their pottery is different. Their diet shows a notable absence of pig bone, a dietary marker that will later become codified in Levitical law. And they practice a form of settlement that suggests a pastoral people who have recently begun to sedentarize, to put down roots in a landscape they have been moving through seasonally. These people are most plausibly proto-Israelites. They are the ancestors of the people who will, within a few centuries, write down the traditions that become the Hebrew Bible. Where did they come from? The archaeological signature suggests they came primarily from within Canaan itself, from the collapse of the late Bronze Age Canaanite city-state system, which fell into ruin around 1200 BCE for reasons that scholars still debate, involving some combination of drought, seismic activity, external invasion, and internal social collapse. They did not come from Egypt. This is not a fringe position. It is the consensus of mainstream Near Eastern archaeology. William Dever, one of America's foremost biblical archaeologists, a man who spent decades excavating Israelite sites, and who describes himself as a cultural Protestant with a deep personal investment in the historical accuracy of the Hebrew Bible, published his conclusions in Who Were the Early Israelites and Where Did They Come From? In 2003. The early Israelites, Dever concluded, were largely indigenous Canaanites who differentiated themselves culturally and religiously from their neighbors over time. The Exodus narrative, in his reading, may preserve the memory of a much smaller group, perhaps a few thousand people, who did have some historical connection to Egypt, but the story was amplified, nationalized, made the origin myth of an entire people who had never been to Egypt at all. This is the mechanism by which origin myths operate. You take a real event, a migration, an escape, a founding moment, and you project it backward onto the whole of the people, so that everyone's ancestors were present, so that the story belongs to all of them. The memory of a small group who escaped becomes the memory of a nation. The story becomes true, in the sense that it is theirs, even if it is not true, in the sense that it happened the way it is described. But Moses stands at the center of this projection, and Moses is where the archaeological record goes not merely silent, but actively contradictory. There is a name that appears in Egyptian records that has fascinated scholars for decades. It appears in the Merempta Stele, dated to approximately 1208 BCE. The same Merempta whose border official wrote the papyrus about Shasu nomads crossing at Tijeku. The stele is a victory inscription recording Merempta's military campaigns in Canaan. Near the end, it contains a line that reads in translation, "Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more." This is the earliest known mention of Israel as a people in any extra-biblical source. It is also, depending on how you read it, a devastating problem for the Exodus narrative. If Israel is already a people in Canaan in 1208 BCE, being recorded by the Egyptian state as a settled or semi-settled group that has been militarily subdued, then when were they in Egypt? The traditional Exodus chronology places the departure from Egypt somewhere between 1250 and 1200 BCE. which would mean that Israel arrived in Canaan, established itself sufficiently to attract the attention of the Egyptian military, and was recorded as a known Canaanite group almost simultaneously with their supposed departure from Egypt. The timeline collapses. Some scholars argue for an earlier exodus, placing Moses in the reign of Thutmose III or Amenhotep II in the 15th century BCE. This solves the Merempta problem, but creates new ones. It removes the only plausible candidate for a pharaoh whose name contains the element that sounds like Ramesses, and it extends the period of supposed wilderness wandering in ways that generate their own archaeological problems. Here is what is certain. A people called Israel existed. They are in the record by 1208 BCE. They built villages in the Canaanite highlands and developed a distinctive religious and cultural identity over the course of the Iron Age. They wrote texts, magnificent texts, texts of extraordinary literary power, texts that have shaped the moral imagination of the world for 2,500 years. Those texts include a story of bondage and liberation, a story of a man who stood before the greatest power in the ancient world and demanded the freedom of his people, a story of law given not by a king, but by a God who spoke to a man on a mountain. That story is not confirmed by the stones. The stones are silent, but the story has done something in the world that the stones cannot do. It has given generations of people a language for their own bondage and their own deliverance. It has traveled across centuries and continents, and arrived in the mouths of people who were enslaved, colonized, imprisoned, and persecuted, and it has told them something they needed to hear. You are not what they have made you. You were made for something else. Whether Moses carried that message down from a literal mountain in the Sinai, or whether the memory of something real, a small group of escaped workers, a charismatic leader, a confrontation with Egyptian power, a generation of wandering on the margins of the civilized world, was amplified and transformed and made mythic by the people who needed it most. The message arrived, and it has not stopped moving. The 6 findings this documentary has examined: the absence of remains in the Sinai, the failed Exodus chronology at Tel el-Dab'a, the Egyptian silence on a catastrophe of biblical proportions, the indigenous origin of the highland Israelites, the Egyptian etymology of Moses' name, and the late literary construction of the Exodus narrative, do not add up to proof that Moses never existed. They add up to proof that the Moses who exists in the text is not the Moses of history. They are different things. What you do with that distinction is your work to do. The scholars have done theirs. The ground has given what it has to give. The question now is what you were actually looking for when you first heard the name, and whether what you found is something you can carry forward. The tradition has survived the loss of the temple, the exile, the Inquisition, the Holocaust. It will survive the question of whether its founding figure was a historical man. It may, in fact, be stronger for finally being asked to stand on the only foundation that has ever held anything worth standing on. Not the bedrock of literal fact, but the more demanding, more human, more enduring ground of what we choose to carry with us. And why, if you have watched this far, you are someone willing to look at hard evidence and sit with a hard question. That is not nothing. Share this with someone who needs to have this conversation. And if the questions this raises are ones you want to keep pulling on, the archaeology of the Bible, the origins of monotheism, the history of what we believe and why we believe it, then stay close, because the ground still has things to say. The absence of Moses in the archaeological record is not the end of the story. It may be where the real story finally begins. In 1990, the Israel Antiquities Authority completed a systematic survey of the Sinai Peninsula and the eastern delta of Egypt. 40 years of fieldwork, thousands of excavated sites, and the number of campsites, settlements, or material remains attributable to a population of 600,000 people wandering for 40 years in that desert was precisely 0. Not scarce, not ambiguous. 0. If that is true, if no trace of the Exodus has survived in the very soil it was supposed to have crossed, then the foundation beneath one of the most consequential stories in human history is not cracked. It may not exist at all. And if Moses is not historical, then the covenant he carried down from that mountain, the law that shaped 3 of the world's great religions, and the liberation narrative that has sustained oppressed peoples across centuries, may be resting on a man who never drew breath. What follows is not an assault on faith. It is not an argument that the story of Moses is worthless, or that the people who carried it did not carry something real. It is a forensic examination of record. The stones speak. The papyri speak. The silence of the archaeological record is itself a kind of testimony. You deserve to hear what all of it says. By the end of this, you will know why the world's leading Israeli archaeologist, a man who spent his career excavating the Exodus route, publicly declared that Moses could not have existed as the Bible describes him. And you will understand why that declaration, made at a press conference in Tel Aviv in 2001, was buried beneath a single news cycle and forgotten before the week was out. What neither timeline can resolve is the population problem. 600,000 fighting men, 2 million people, no trace in the Sinai, no trace at Kadesh Barnea, no Egyptian records of their presence or departure. The numbers in the text are not just unsupported. They are, in the view of scholars like John Bright, and even the more traditionally minded Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen, almost certainly symbolic rather than literal. The kind of inflated numbers ancient texts use to convey significance, the way Homer speaks of 1,000 ships and does not mean the reader to perform the calculation. If the numbers are symbolic, what else is symbolic? And if Moses is a symbolic figure, a composite, a retrospective construction, the projected prophet of a people who needed a lawgiver, does that change what his story has done in the world? This is the question that historians and theologians have spent generations circling without landing. It is also perhaps the wrong question. The name Moses is not a Hebrew name. This is not a controversial claim. It is a standard observation in biblical scholarship, noted by scholars ranging from Sigmund Freud in his 1939 work, Moses and Monotheism, to the Egyptologist Jan Assmann in his extensive work on the Moses memory. The name derives from the Egyptian root Muz, or Mesu, meaning son of or born of. It is the same root found in Egyptian royal names, Thutmose, meaning born of Thoth, Ramesses, meaning born of Ra, Ahmose, born of Ah. The Hebrew explanation offered in Exodus, that the name comes from the Hebrew masha, meaning to draw out, because Pharaoh's daughter drew the infant from the water, is a folk etymology, a popular explanation retrofitted onto a name that already existed. Why would a Hebrew slave child be given an Egyptian name? One answer is that he was raised as an Egyptian, as the text itself says. Another answer is that this detail of the name was preserved, because it was true, because it came from a time before the narrative was fully constructed, when the fragments of the story still carried their original marks. A third answer is that Moses, or the tradition behind Moses, originated within an Egyptian cultural context entirely, not as a Hebrew born into slavery, but as an Egyptian who encountered the monotheistic current that had briefly surfaced during the Amarna period of Akhenaten's reign, and carried some version of it out of Egypt and into Canaan. This is Freud's argument, and it is Jan Assmann's more sophisticated version of it in Moses the Egyptian, published in 1997. Assmann is not arguing that Moses was definitely Akhenaten, or a disciple of Akhenaten. He is arguing that the Moses memory, the cultural memory of a monotheistic lawgiver who confronted Egyptian power, may have encoded a historical reality that the text itself has transformed beyond recognition. The Aten religion, Akhenaten's radical monotheism, which swept away the Egyptian pantheon and placed a single solar deity at the center of Egyptian spiritual life, and which was violently suppressed after Akhenaten's death around 1336 BCE, disappeared from Egyptian public life. But it did not disappear from human memory. Asman argues that it survived, transformed, compressed, attributed to a new protagonist and a new people, and emerged centuries later as the tradition that would become the Hebrew Bible. This is not a comfortable argument for anyone. For traditional believers, it suggests that the most sacred foundational narrative of monotheism may have originated in the heresy of a foreign king. For secularists, it requires taking seriously the notion that mythological traditions preserve real historical memory in deeply encoded forms. For archaeologists, it cannot be confirmed or denied by the tools of excavation. It lives in the space between text and artifact, between memory and history, where the most important human questions have always lived. What it does is this: it shifts the question. Not did Moses exist, but what memory does Moses carry? Not is the Exodus literally true, but what truth is the Exodus telling? There is a scholar named Donald Redford, a Canadian Egyptologist, who spent 40 years analyzing every Egyptian document that might bear on the Exodus question. His 1992 work, Egypt, Canaan, and Israel in Ancient Times, is a monument of careful scholarship. Redford's conclusion is precise and worth examining closely. He found that the Joseph story, the narrative that explains how the Israelites came to be in Egypt in the first place, contains details that correspond to Egyptian administrative practices of the Sete period, roughly 600 BCE. Not the Bronze Age, not the period of Ramesses, the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, when Egyptians and Israelites were in sustained contact, when Israelite scribes would have had access to Egyptian court traditions, when a story of a Hebrew rising to prominence in the Egyptian administration would have been both imaginable and politically resonant. This is the method of archaeology applied to text. Redford was not excavating soil. He was excavating language, administrative terminology, documentary conventions. And what he found suggests that the stories were written, in their present form, far later than the events they describe, and were written by people drawing on the Egypt they knew, not the Egypt of 500 years before their birth. This is not unique to the Hebrew Bible. Ancient texts do this universally. Homer's Iliad, whatever historical kernel it may preserve from the Mycenaean Bronze Age collapse, is written in the language and with the cultural assumptions of the Iron Age Greeks who produced it. The Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh preserves traditions that may reach back to a historical king of Uruk in the 3rd millennium BCE, but the text as we have it was assembled by scribes in the 1st millennium. The medium is always its own era. The memory is always passed through the hands of people who are not witnesses. What is distinctive about Moses, and what makes the archaeological silence so specifically troubling, is the claim to literal, datable, locatable history. The text does not say, "In the time before memory, in the age of the gods, a great lawgiver led his people out of bondage." It names pharaohs. It names cities. It names a route. It gives a duration of 40 years. It makes the kind of specific, verifiable claims that invite the scrutiny of the archaeologist. And when the archaeologist comes, the ground has nothing to say. The 6 bombshells, as the title of this documentary frames them, are not really bombshells. They are not revelations that somebody hid. They are the slow accumulation of decades of careful scholarship. Biatak at Tel el Dabah, Oren at Kadesh Barnea, Finkelstein at Tel Aviv, Redford in the papyri, Dever in the highland villages, Assman in the cultural memory traditions. That has produced a scholarly consensus most people outside of academic biblical studies have never been told about, not because of a conspiracy, because the conversation that would require the public to hold these findings in one hand and their faith in the other is a conversation that almost no institution has been willing to facilitate. What does it mean if Moses was not a historical figure in the way the text presents him? It means that the law was not handed to a man on a mountain. It means the covenant was not witnessed. It means the narrative of liberation that has sustained Jewish identity through millennia of persecution, that animated the African-American freedom struggle, that gave Harriet Tubman the name Moses, that gave Mandela a framework for speaking about dignity and deliverance. It means that narrative was constructed, built, shaped by human hands and human needs over centuries of cultural evolution. Does that diminish it? This is the question you are left holding. And you should hold it carefully, because the answer is not obvious. The scholars who have done the most to dismantle the historical Moses are not, for the most part, people who believe the tradition is worthless. Finkelstein, who has done as much as anyone to demonstrate the archaeological impossibility of the Exodus as written, has also written extensively about the literary and cultural genius of the biblical authors. Assman, who traces the Moses memory to Egyptian roots, regards the tradition as one of the most consequential acts of cultural memory in human history. Dever, who believes the Exodus involved a tiny fraction of the people the text describes, still argues that understanding what the text is doing, how it works, what it preserves, requires taking it seriously as a document. The difference is between sacred truth and historical fact. These have never been the same thing, and the insistence that they must be the same thing, that a story is only worth believing if it literally happened the way it was written, is itself a relatively recent development in the long history of how human beings have related to their foundational narratives. The rabbis of the Talmudic period were not literalists. They argued. They interpreted. They held contradictions and productive tension. They understood, on some level, that the text was a living conversation, not a fixed record. What the archaeological record does, when it refuses to confirm the literal Exodus, is not destroy the tradition. It restores it to the only ground on which any tradition can finally stand. Not the ground of the Sinai desert, which has been thoroughly searched, but the ground of human meaning-making, which is the only archaeology that ultimately answers the questions people are actually asking.